So the question is, why do we need to think about crisis? Why is there a crisis about crisis? Now, it sounds like a straightforward question, but it isn't. And what I'm going to say sounds like I'm just playing with words, because the reality is that there is a crisis of crisis. And effectively what that means is people recognise that there are all sorts of things that are now being called and designated as crisis. But the actuality, the reality, the complexity of the crisis doesn't really arrive. So, in a sense, a crisis of crisis is a lack of appearance of the nature and the complexity of crisis. Because nearly all the things that get presented as crisis are in fact connected. They aren't single things. There isn't just climate change. There isn't just a problem of loss of biodiversity. There isn't just a problem of the breakdown of the geopolitical order. There isn't just a crisis of conflict. There isn't just a crisis of stress of resources. There isn't just a crisis of displaced populations. All of these things have a relation to each other in something which is greater than their individual entity components. The whole is greater than the sum of these parts. Well, the challenge of the crisis of crisis is to try to find a means of making its complexity present, of making the complexity of its complexity present, of kind of finding a language, finding an image that kind of recognises that we're in a situation that is unique, that has never existed before. Now, obviously, lots of people will say, but isn't the case, hasn't life always been one where crises arrive, where crisis is actually part of our condition of being in the world? Now, of course, that's true. But we've never been in a position where it's been possible to see at one moment the convergence of all sorts of critical conditions in the world at the same time. So we've kind of moved from, very simplistically, existentially, crises being something which people experience locally, to a kind of a larger frame of them being understood and encountered nationally and then internationally, but now globally. At the same time as that kind of enormous opening of a world picture, there is also the kind of the intensification of the condition of crisis as a result of the amplification of our actions, both in relation to each other and in relation to planetary conditions. And really what that means is that in the end there is a kind of a convergence between us as really being generators of crisis and the recipients of crisis. And that crisis, in one sense, has put our own future under kind of erasure, but also the erasure of many other forms of life. So, again, one of the things that is unique about this crisis is that there is kind of an increasingly wide understanding that we are in a condition being described as an extinction event, the sixth time that there has been a planetary situation that extinguishes an enormous amount of life on this planet. We are, in fact, the kind of biological afterlife of previous extinction events. So there is now the question of, what will exist after we no longer exist. So that becomes a kind of a psychological condition. Now that psychological condition kind of really divides almost into kind of two classes of being in the world. The condition that isn't kind of both felt and known through the ways in which kind of knowledge and information and theory has presented crisis. So there's a, if you like, a kind of a metaphysical understanding of crisis that has an emotional impact and dimension. But in contrast, and this applies to almost the dominant number of people on the planet, there is a kind of an emotional feeling of being in crisis, but without the kind of the knowledge of its complexity and nature. So differentially, that goes back to kind of the local, but also the way that the local now kind of folds in to the global, so that you have on the one hand a metaphysical emotional understanding of crisis and an emotional global understanding of crisis.
When you talk about the metaphysical understanding of crisis, would you be referring there to the sort of notion of the end of the grand narratives of the modern, of enlightenment and so on?
Yeah, I mean the nature of the crisis itself is a compound condition, as I've said. It's the convergence of all sorts of things, and the kind of the metaphysical understanding is also a kind of a compound of kind of many different ways in which the crisis has been interrogated, theorized, and narrated. So, on the one hand, it includes all the kind of scientific ways in which crisis arrives, but equally all the existential ways that crisis arrives, and that really then throws up questions of what we are and what we are becoming. So the existential crisis, is predicated on the one hand in terms of the conditions which we are experiencing, mediated through the knowledge that we've acquired, but also in a sense of how we are changing and what we are becoming, and the uncertainty of our being, which is really kind of epitomized by the whole discussion of the post-human. So part of the crisis is that we are no longer clear exactly what we are or what we're becoming.
In the sense that we're becoming more technological beings?
Well, some of us are becoming more technological beings, but there isn't a single telos, there's not a single direction. So, contrary to the narrative of evolution, which creates a kind of an image of us developing in a particular developmental direction, what it looks more like now is that there are multiple directions. There is a kind of, at one extreme, the direction of being abandoned beings, where the conditions of our existence are actually deteriorating. Our ability to improve our situation is becoming reduced. And then at the other extreme is a kind of a technocentric a privileged condition where people are thinking about how they can, in a sense, create a barrier between the crisis and their conditions of existence by creating a technical bubble that actually protects them. Ontologically, these two extremes mean that we are becoming something different in very different circumstances. So the kind of the ontological creation of the transformation of our being is becoming dramatically pluralized.
If you could take two examples of the crisis, like okay, you mentioned climate change, two that would seem unrelated, but actually are related. Can you talk about that?
Yes, well, I mean, very, very simply, the way in which kind of climate change gets presented to us is that there are things around us in the world which are changing as a result of increased temperatures and local variations of climate. So there are all the kind of characterizations of different impacts. So in a way that's how an imaginary of climate change is being created. Whereas how climate changed us, how it kind of affects how we are and what we do, and how that created our environmental and physiological differences, how it transforms the way that we live, the way that we dress, what we eat, existentially, the very nature of our life, doesn't actually come into that picture. So, in many respects, we are, as part of the environment, just as much of a product of climate than everything else in the environment. But it's as though climate change discourse places us outside all of that as an observer of what is actually happening. So what is actually happening to us is kind of rendered invisible. So what that creates is an entirely false sense of necessary action.
Because it's a discourse that we still need this amount of energy and we need these facilities, and do we get them via hydrogen or via some other technology?
So the way in which the problem is approached as if it is a technological problem that needs to be solved technologically, rather than being a problem of the nature of being, and how the primary concern is how we become able to adapt, not just mechanically, not just in a sense organisationally, to a changing climate, but how we fundamentally adapt to become other than we are in response to changing conditions.
There's a political dimension too, in that it could mean, well, increasingly it means there are many places in the world with built environment cities that perhaps should not be inhabited at all and will not be able to be inhabited.
Well, there are two fundamental questions politically. There is, and I just characterised them as the kind of the historical political question, and there's the kind of the futural political question. The historical political question is one that exposes the error of the political decisions of the past. So what happened is most of those decisions were pragmatic, without necessarily taking into account the consequence of those decisions. So at the most general level, where it was decided to create a city, was based often, purely on pragmatic needs, economic needs. So where it was possible to get goods to a market in an efficient way, where a population could be gathered, where there were the materials to build the city and so on. What that led to is the construction of cities often environmentally in totally inappropriate places. So now what we have very large numbers of port cities built on river deltas that are very unstable, that were in fact not a good place to build a city, and are very, very vulnerable. So if you take a city like Jakarta, which is kind of listed for abandonment, because the proposal is for a new capital of Indonesia to be built in Kalimantan. The reason for that decision is the combination of the city sinking, because it's built on silt, and sea level rises increasing, and the kind of the density of the population in relation to that space on the island. So, those kind of problems are replicated all around the world. So the political decisions of the past, have been made without foresight. The same applies to the development of industries. The consequence of industrial development, more or less at the time of industrialization, kind of ignored the impacts of that activity. So you had, the crisis of absolutely totally polluted industrial cities where people were dying from respiratory illnesses as a result of that industrial activity, which over the early 20th century through to the mid-20th century started to get cleaned up. What actually went unrecognised were the more invisible consequences of industrialisation, i.e. global warming. So what we've actually done is to only address those things which were absolutely evident. So part of the crisis of crisis again is the inability for the less visible to be recognised. And that really goes to the core of the problem of the political, and links to the notion of a political future, because that complexity just has not arrived politically. The political leadership of nations, the political leadership internationally, is in a sense still looking at the problem from the past rather than from the future. It is not confronting the depth of the crisis that we're in. The policies that are made are not being made in time. They are not recognising that you cannot solve the kind of problems that we've now got by making decisions over the length of the duration of a government and so on, or even the length or the duration of several decades. So, again, global warming is a very easy example of the nature of this problem. So, governments are making policies like the reduction of emissions by such and such a date. And that date is never very far away, 20, 30, 40, 50 years away. But the reality that's been dealt with are conditions that have to be seen in a much larger frame of time. So atmospherically, greenhouse gases stay around for hundreds and in some cases thousands of years. There are still emissions in the atmosphere that were generated in the Industrial Revolution. So the situation atmospherically takes a long time to correct. Now, the consequence of warming has an enormous effect on the oceans. The deep oceans are the kind of the thermostat of the planet, and they take several hundred years to correct. Equally, in terms of glacial Arctic and Antarctic ice, they entirely are determined by those ocean temperatures and surface temperatures. So that process can't be stopped quickly either. So what I'm really saying is that we've got politicians and policies in one time frame, and we've got the actual problem, and this is just the problem of climate change, in an entirely different one, which is a time frame of hundreds and possibly thousands of years. So there's a massive disjuncture, as it were, between the political relation between cause and effect. And then the consequences of all of these changes, have an enormous geopolitical effect in how they affect the relations between nations, how they increase tensions between nations. So equally, the more unstable the crisis is biophysically, the more unstable it becomes politically. So I think you can see, the nature of the situation that we're in is things that are disjunctural. They're not actually being understood as in relation to each other. They're not being addressed as a kind of a field of causal complexity. They are a product of a division of knowledge and a mode of thinking that really kind of resides back in the Enlightenment. We haven't got the relational complexity of thought, certainly in the political field, able to address the situation. And, intellectually, theoretically, philosophically, that this kind of way of thinking is still being struggled to be developed. So one of the ironies of the situation that we're in, it really demands a huge amount of investment in, if you like, thinking in a philosophy for a future understanding. And again, the negation of responsibility of politics is it's sending everything in exactly in the opposite direction, where both economic life, the instrumentalism of knowledge, the direction that universities are being sent in, is in exactly the opposite direction to the direction necessary to deal with the problem. So the kind of the instrumentalism as a kind of a culture of resistance, a culture of familiarity, gets everybody kind of orientated to try to solve problems practically, when the problems that are being understood are just incoherent, are just not sufficiently rendered in a way where they can actually be addressed. So, a part of the crisis of the crisis is a massive, massive intellectual crisis.